Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I am Elizabeth Goldstein, the president of MAS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third session in a series of our programming entitled The Future of Open Space. Our first two sessions discussed how cities are looking to open space to ease some of the pressures of physical distancing during this time of crisis. These panels have covered community-centered planning for the reclamation and activation of streets, design guidelines for distancing, and the role of the streetscape in the survival of small businesses. 2020 has underscored the importance of the public realm and its critical role in the livability and recovery of our city. Tonight's program will focus on green spaces, from your neighborhood parks and gardens to playgrounds and greenways. These spaces are critical to the well-being of our city and every New Yorker. On October 22nd, MAS gave testimony to the New York City Council Committee on Parks and Recreation on the issue of parks equity, or lack thereof. While the use of green space has increased tremendously during COVID, long-time structural inequities remain, further evidenced by the disproportionate health impacts affecting low-income areas and communities of color. In our 2019 report, Bright Ideas, MAS and our partners, New Yorkers for Parks, came together to call for the creation of a director of the public realm, a new position tasked with coordinating the constellation of public and private entities that oversee our public spaces, including the green ones. Today, we will hear a discussion on the importance of accessibility and equity in green spaces and how these spaces are adapting to the current challenges and potential long-term solutions here and across the nation. Before we begin, there are a few things to note. Using the chat function, you can comment and interact with one another. There is also a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. There you can share any questions that you have, and our panelists will take time towards the end to answer them. We have also added some tips in the chat for your reference. If you need assistance, you can chat MAS staff directly, and they are marked with MAS under the participant list. Our program today is anticipated to run about an hour and is being recorded. A recording will be available later on our YouTube channel and Facebook pages, as are the previous programs in this series. You will also be able to view our other programs as well. As a reminder, tonight's program offers one free CM credit to AICP members. It is now my enormous pleasure to introduce Susan Chin, our moderator for the evening. Susan is an accomplished architect, urbanist, and civic leader, has formed an independent design consultancy called Design Connects, and serves on New York & Co. board and the East Midtown Governing Group. She recently led Design Trust for Public Space that unlocks the potential of New York City's public spaces and has been doing so since 1995. Prior to the Design Trust, she was an assistant commissioner for capital projects at the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, supporting architecture and public art citywide. She also serves on the American Institute of Architects board and has been an AIA New York chapter president. I am delighted to turn things over now to Susan, who will be introducing our panelists for this evening. So let's get started.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And for some reason, my email just popped up. Yes, thank you, and to Municipal Art Society for this series, The Future of Open Space, Adaptation, Access, and Equity. Today, we focus on open green spaces and the outsized role they've played during the COVID pandemic for New Yorkers' health, well-being, and sense of community. As our realms have become hyper-local, green spaces have become our resilient infrastructure for refuge, living classrooms, outdoor cafes, places to sit, walk, run, play, cycle, and breathe. Now, as colder weather approaches, are these interventions all temporary? Will we revert back to normal? In the past 8 months, we found we need even more open space. Yet many neighborhoods remain underserved and under-resourced. Ironically, New York City's borough with the most parkland is the Bronx. It's got 1,700 parks. However, many families, frontline workers and Black and brown New Yorkers who need green space the most aren't within walking distance. That's also true of Bensonhurst and Borough Park in Brooklyn or Jackson Heights in Queens, Chinatown and Stuyvesant Town in Manhattan. Parks make up only 14% or 29,000 acres of our city's open space. In New York City, where every square foot is hotly contested for its highest and best use, how do we now advocate for permanently expanding and strengthening our green space network? Parks, community gardens, ball fields, schoolyards, greenways, waterfronts, as well as old landfills, vacant lots, green roofs, more shared streets, or even decking over highways as a bellwether for our future city and essential tool for our city's resilience and recovery. So, what if we made New York City the greenest and most equitable city in the nation by 2050? Now to begin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michelle Kondo, research social scientist, Northern Research Station at the USDA Forest Service. And Michelle's research examines nature and place-based strategies and clinical interventions for violence, injury, and disease prevention, with a focus on underserved urban communities. Her work includes community participation in place-based initiatives on health outcomes, and also partnerships with health professionals, nonprofits, and land managers. She holds academic degrees in civil engineering, urban planning, and postdoctoral training in environmental health and epidemiology from the University of Pennsylvania. Michelle, you've got a unique combination of expertise. Could you share more about the role of green space in public health, safety and recovery of urban areas such as greening vacant lots? And what relationship do green spaces have to disease prevention? We look forward to hearing about your research.
Sure. Thanks. I'm going to first, I think right now I'll just talk about some of those established relationships between green space and health. And a little bit later, I think in the panel can bring in some of my specific research looking at green space as violence prevention and impacts on stress. So let's see, I'm going to share my slides. So as Susan mentioned, I am a scientist and I work for the U.S. Forest Service. I think that not many are aware that the Forest Service is active and or even has a presence in cities, but so, our primary mission is to manage the national forests, which, there are about 190 million acres of them across the US, mostly in the West, is true, but there are almost 170 million acres of trees and forests in urban areas. And so it is the Forest Service plays it's part of our duty to support those resources for current and future generations. And it does so primarily through research, supporting research. And we have a number of field stations, and including in New York City, as well as Baltimore, Chicago, Denver, and we have a growing number. Well, it's not been growing here for a few years, but we will hopefully return to an era of growth. So just recently this year, just to start off, my colleagues and I published a study where we took some new estimates about the relationship between how green our neighborhoods are with our risk of premature death from any cause. It could be disease or injury, but we have these amazing estimates out there now built on millions of health data points and or death records. And so this estimate we took from, it was based on over 8 million participants in 7 different countries. And we applied it to the City of Philadelphia's tree canopy cover goal by 2025 to have a 30% tree canopy cover throughout the city in every neighborhood. And so we said, well, how many premature deaths would this prevent? You see the answer here that we came up with. And yes, this is a very ambitious goal. And in fact, we called it that. And we made some estimates as well for some more perhaps realistic goals. But so this is, some of the evidence that we're starting to be able to apply to some real, policy and programs, initiatives, tree planting initiatives, greening initiatives, and the real difference that it makes in our lives and our livelihoods. But so mortality and reduced premature mortality is just one piece of evidence, sort of an endpoint, right? But we also know, well, how is this happening? We know that being in green space, being in nature, especially compared to being in an urban environment, really can reduce our stress. So you can hook participants up to in all sorts of ways, blood pressure cuffs and heart rate monitors, and have them spit in a cup. And we know that our stress physiological response to our environment will respond. This is a short-term response, and we probably everyone here knows this. But we also know that we have better mental health, less anxiety, less depression, and as well as a better ability to pay attention, so better cognitive performance. In this slide here, there's a list of all of the sort of health outcomes that are starting to build evidence. We're starting to build an evidence base about the benefits of nature exposure on human health. And I would say those in bold, there's probably a more solid evidence base there. But so, and the research, as you see, has focused on adults. There's more to do and explore in terms of for children. But also important to talk about, well, how does this all work? Why and how does green space exposure impact our health and well-being? And I like this model here, that talks about these 3 pathways through reducing harm or mitigation. So trees can reduce air pollution. They can pick up particles from the air. They can reduce our exposure to noise. Act as sound barriers. Trees can also reduce heat. We know this, right? As living in the city, green space can help in terms of our restoration, again, so our ability to pay attention and our physiological stress response. And then also help in building our capacities. So if we have access to green space, we may be more likely to get more physical activity. And then there's a lot of evidence here in terms of building our social cohesion, that parks, green spaces really help bring us together and associate with one another more. And as we know, isolation is a big killer. So trees and green space, that is one of the mechanisms that they improve a whole host and list of health aspects of our health. I just want to put a plug in here about some resources that you may find useful. So the Forest Service has done a review of literature, and this is a report that's available for your download. You just Google it. And I see, I've got the URL there, but focused on urban nature. So not just nature in general, but urban nature and its impact on human health and well-being. And you could also check out the Vibrant Cities Lab website that also posts latest research, as well as lists of best practices and some self-assessment tools, guides, and other resources. And this is the research in terms of impact. So I like that it shares it. There is research listed here, but also a host of case studies, which sometimes can be even way more useful than the research and the journal articles. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Susan. Back to Susan.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. That was really fascinating, and we'll talk about this more. And just a reminder for the audience to please post your questions at the bottom of your screen. So Benita Hussain, next up is Benita Hussain, director of our 10-minute walk at Trust for Public Land. Benita leads the award-winning 10-minute walk effort to ensure that 100% of all U.S. urban residents live within an easy walk of a park or green space by 2050. She has over 15 years experience in urban sustainability and served as policy advisor to Michael R. Bloomberg on his Compact of Mayors, a coalition to tackle climate change. She's launched Greenway Boston, a campaign of the late Mayor Menino's to reduce carbon emissions by 80%. Benita was an attorney at the firm of Morrison and Foerster, LLP, and holds degrees from Cornell University, Fordham Law School, and has written for The Hill, Sustainable Brands, and Boston Globe. Benita, you're now at a national organization. Would you share experience from other cities on the 10-minute walk campaign and how they compare to New York, which ranks, I think, 11th nationally for its park score?
Right.
So.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan. It's great to be here. I'll just do a quick screen share as well. But, really the idea behind the 10-minute walk is really around this idea of safe, equitable access. We are a movement that has led by the Trust for Public Land alongside a number of national partners, all with this simple idea that we want to bring all people within a 10-minute walk of a park or green space by 2050. And we do that in sort of 3 different ways. And I will return to your question about how all of these cities rank against each other. But we really don't necessarily think of this as a competition as much as we want to just encourage and raise the ambitions of cities all across the country. We do this by collecting commitments from mayors. So far we have about 300 mayors that are pledged to this idea of safe and equitable access to parks, green spaces by 2050. We are building a coalition of national and local partners, who I will mention a little bit later on as well, who are all sort of these like-minded partners that really know that parks and green space are linked to a number of benefits across the country, which Michelle also touched on. We think of these ideals around 10-minute walk park access, 100% park access, as not just being about parks, but really about transforming cities themselves. So it's important for us to link this work to climate resilience, to walkability, to density, to affordable housing, et cetera. And our work also does link up all of our cities to different forms of technical assistance, including ranging from grants to helping with mapping services and data and other tools that cities really need to help move the needle on park access. I do want to mention that when we do talk about park access, we are not just talking about 10-minute walk. And I think that's something that's really important as we build this movement and as more and more people are talking about this work, especially in the last 6 months, as we see how important park access is in time of pandemic and of course during times of protest. We talk about proximity as one piece of park access, but when we talk to our cities, we really think about what does it mean to easily and safely get to a park? Is there a highway built there? Are the sidewalks safe? Are the crosswalks safe? Are these parks built near communities that are highest in need? Are these parks responsive to the needs of those communities and those users? Are they accessible for all sorts of abilities? And really importantly, and not always, do they impart positive benefits for those communities, including the health and economic and climate benefits that we just talked about, or that Michelle just talked about. But just to get back to your question, Susan, about how all of these cities are doing, I think all cities have really, in the last as we see 6 to 10 months, have really felt this need, this urgent need of how parks are so critical to serve and benefit all of their residents. And I will mention that the campaign has been around for 3 years. And so a lot of these cities, 300 cities that we are working with, had already adopted this target. They already knew that parks and green space was central for the livability of their cities, including New York City. But some of the great ones I like to call out as some of our champions include folks like, it really ends up being sort of the small and mid-sized cities that, may not be at the higher ranking, even though you mentioned New York is at 11th, it's still in the 90s in terms of the number of people that do have access to parks and green space. But folks like Memphis, Tennessee, where we have 41% of residents who have access to parks and green space. The mayor, Mayor Strickland, has a target of 100% park access by 2040. Very ambitious. Obviously takes a lot of work alongside community partners to ensure that he's meeting that goal in ways that are, again, equitable and responsive to the communities. Mayor Carter from St. Paul, also 100% by 2040 is the goal, and really has placed, in both cases, really have placed equity at the center of those targets, really thinking about how do they invest and plan for parks in ways that meet the needs of the communities that have long been forgotten. How do we meet those needs before we start investing in other parks and green spaces? These are large conversations, are very complex, but they are really important for us to be having right now. So I'm just really excited to be here and talking to you folks about the various ways that we can really scale this movement across the country. And here is just a smattering of some of our national partners who have all been incredibly supportive of this idea of safe, equitable park access. So just wanted to give a quick shout out to them. So excited to be here, and Susan, turning it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Benita. I love We're the Park People. Now it's a pleasure to introduce Terri Carta, Executive Director of the Brooklyn Greenway Initiative. Terri's a driving force in completion and long-term stewardship of the Brooklyn Greenway Initiative to realize its full potential as a vital open space. The Greenway connects people and neighborhoods, contributes to New York's sustainability and resiliency plans, and promotes community-based visioning and stewardship. Terri's leadership includes nonprofit management, public engagement, community and leadership development, such as Central Park Conservancy's Institute for Urban Parks, and watershed management in West Africa. Terri's passion about advancing a transdisciplinary approach to improving urban environments and the greater public realm. She holds degrees in ecological teaching and conservation biology. So Terri, Brooklyn Greenway's mission is to connect New Yorkers to 4 parks and green spaces. Please describe, how the Greenway ties into co-benefits of health, social welfare, environment, and the economy, as well as just other aspects of your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you to Municipal Art Society for this panel. And I'm thrilled to be here with panelists Michelle and Benita. I'm going to share screen very quickly. Okay. So at Brooklyn Greenway Initiative, we are a nonprofit that's dedicated to greenways as a typology, particularly the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway and greenways throughout Brooklyn and beyond. Very quick primer on what is a greenway for anybody who is not, doesn't use the term every day like I do. We really think about and talk about greenways as connectors, as you just said, Susan. They're green spaces connected with the route, green spaces and the way to get there. Another way that we describe them is, linear park meets transportation corridor. And you can see in the slide here the, kind of imagery that connotes. And in the context of COVID, just to highlight this very quickly, we're talking about transportation and open space. And the Greenway provides both. And so in this era of, living through a pandemic and looking at what we do from here, where we go from here, and how greenways as a vital piece of our public realm infrastructure can help us move forward better. So where are greenways in New York City? The map on the left, kind of zooms into the borough of Brooklyn, which is where our work is mostly focused at BGI. And you can see that the greenways, those darker green lines connect our parks and open space. So there's, the Brooklyn Waterfront Greenway that goes around the coastline of Brooklyn. There's Ocean Parkway, the sort of the line that goes up and down, north-south, which is the country's first greenway in the late 19th century that was, kind of brought forward by Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, the same guys who designed and built Central Park and Prospect Park and many other green spaces around the country. There is, the Brooklyn Queens Greenway, and there's a whole host of greenways throughout the 5 boroughs. And they, as you can see on the map, they go through parks, they go to parks, and oftentimes they also connect us with, the 6th borough. I don't mean New Jersey, I mean the waterfront, New York Harbor, East River, and the waterways of New York City, kind of reminding us that we are a coastal city, we're a city of islands, and that the 520 miles of coastline throughout the city, that greenways are an important way to connect people with that open space, that type of open space as well. So at BGI, our work is really centered on this idea of the greenway as a route, as combining it with green space. And in areas of the city, in areas of Brooklyn where green space is not that prevalent, we've been active over our about 20-year history in advocating for or in one particular case, creating new green space. The Naval Cemetery landscape is the picture on the bottom right, which is on the site of the former Naval Hospital Cemetery at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And now we're in our 5th year of operation. It's an award-winning, actually, award-winning public space. It just won this last year an ASLA National Honor Award for its design. It's recognized as an official monarch way station for its diversity and abundance of native plants for monarch butterflies and other pollinators. And it's really, again, this combination of the green space and a way to get between them and through them that we're advocating for. But I do want to point out that it's not just about green space for us, that Susan, you asked about, and Benita and Michelle, you've all mentioned the co-benefits that come from greenways and green spaces at large. So the benefits that come from a greenway extend to, habitat corridors and a way for small species to travel between parks and open space. Obviously, the environmental benefits that come from increased canopy and tree-lined streets. Obviously, also we're talking about access to parks and green space. And, Benita, as you pointed out, it's not just about getting there, but the experience and how that access is shared equitably throughout all communities. The Greenway, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the transportation benefits, both from a mobility standpoint as well as a climate impact solution, in that the Greenway is and can be used as a micromobility transportation solution, thereby reducing greenhouse gas emissions from cars, for example. The more people who are using bikes and greenways to get around, greenways are a safe, when they are built and designed well, and when they're networked, are a safe way for people to get around with active transportation. They definitely contribute to community cohesion. And I mentioned the waterfront. In the case of the waterfront greenways in Brooklyn and other, the other boroughs in New York City, the greenways can provide some coastal resiliency and protection against storm surge, for example. And then definitely access to jobs and job centers, and health and wellness benefits. So, but I do want to highlight in terms of how we want to move forward from here. It's not all roses, right? There are some thorns here and there that we need to work through as a city. And the map on the left again highlights this. And that is the disconnection, or the lack of full connectivity, the lack of a full network being built in New York City as of yet. There are many segments, but there's not a complete whole. So that people's experience is not contiguous. It means that the benefits that greenways provide is not contiguous. Safety, right, is not delivered in a continuous or contiguous, equitable fashion. Some communities are safer and greener and more connected, while others still are not. So that's what BGI is focused on now, is completing the Greenway so that, you know, all of the benefits of greenways can be realized by all communities. I have just one other slide here. Oops, maybe it's not going to, there we go. You know, and our kind of call to action in this realm, and it relates to, you know, a director of the public realm in New York City, and, you know, 10-minute walk campaign and other research that's needed. And as we get through the panel, I'd love to talk about BGI's research that we've just launched about the, you know, kind of documenting the benefits of greenways. But really the biggest change, I think, is for New York City to move from our current approach to implementing this kind of infrastructure, which has been reactionary or opportunistic, essentially that the Greenway will be implemented, you know, as funds and opportunity arise. And what we need to do is take a more strategic, proactive approach and prioritize the planning, the design, the construction, and the stewardship of greenways and other public realm infrastructure in ways that the city needs. In the case of greenways specifically, we need the greenways to be networked. We need, you know, that full continuity to be present throughout Brooklyn and throughout all 5 boroughs. So I guess I'll leave it there for now, and I look forward to further discussion with panelists and with the audience. Thank you, Susan.
Great. Thanks, Terri. That leads us into our discussion. And I'll start with a couple questions, and we'll take some of the questions from the audience. So it looks, you know, in terms of development and COVID, you know, as I mentioned earlier, is this just a temporary condition, or is this, you know, how can we think about more permanent solutions to expanding and strengthening this network? How do we make the case now because we will be competing with various developments that are in the works, or that, you know, are seen as being beneficial to our city's economy as we try to recover? I leave that open to any of you.
So I'll just speak on a national level, and actually, and it kind of relates a little bit to what Terri was saying. Is how do we help cities create a sort of a North Star around this work? How do we get them to think strategically? How do we get city leadership to buy in and really commit to these ambitious goals? I mean, as I mentioned, right, the 10-minute walk is an ambitious goal because it really sort of bears on every sector across the city. It requires us for cities to work across parks, transportation, public works, city planning, zoning, and working with private developers to really prioritize the idea of public space and green space as being critical to the functioning of a city and the well-being of its residents. And I think that when we look at the cities that we get, you know, I feel very lucky to be able to work with cities like the ones I mentioned in Pittsburgh and Tacoma and all of these other mayors who have actually created that North Star of 100% access. What ends up happening is the planning and the financing actually can flow, right? And I think this sort of responds a little bit also to one of the questions I saw in the chat, which is like, especially in this time of financial distress, how do we create these efficiencies for city departments to work together? How do we continue that ambition? And what I will say is that a lot of the cities I get to work with had always had that ambition. And now they're just gonna have to get a lot more creative about how to unlock that financing and how to work across agencies to ensure that this work is actually still being strategically implemented. So I think there is still hope, and I think that this the last 6 months, I think all of us working in the space never thought that parks and green space would become such a national issue. And now that it is, I think it's just going to accelerate. And yeah, and I feel fortunate with working with some of the leaders I get to work with.
one of the things that you've been working on, Benita, is partnerships. And I'm sure that Michelle and Terri have been as well. You know, who do you think are some of the leading voices that can amplify, give gravitas to the value of green space and acquiring more?
Do you want, so should I take that and maybe hand it off to Terri as well? Yeah, and I talk about this a little bit. I think it's important for us in the park space to not just look to the usual suspects for all of that support. And I think there's been a lot, so that linkage of the work, you know, Terri's working on this as well, the linkage of climate resilience, and again, all of these other benefits that are happening across cities with parks and green space. There's a lot of different voices. And those are all of the partners that I've been sort of seeking out. Who are the folks that can help amplify the benefits and the importance of parks beyond just being parks for park's sake? And so I think that there's just a lot of different diverse voices. And I certainly don't want to take away from the fact that the community voices of these cities are really, really critical to have at the table, especially now as we see some of the impacts of the pandemic, or most of the impacts of the pandemic and most other crises end up being, you know, shouldered by the frontline communities, BIPOC and lower income communities. And so bringing those folks to the table and bringing the partners that can represent those voices to the table, super critical right now. And I think, and I'm seeing that a little more in our cities as well. And Terri, I don't want to jump ahead.
To respond to, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yes, I agree with everything you just said, Benita, and I'll underscore that in the case of greenways, you know, this is why I kind of defined what is a greenway, that probably a lot of us, you know, on this panel or in the audience, I should say, you know, are familiar with greenways if we live in New York City, and if we're, you know, interested in a topic like the one here tonight, we probably have a better idea of what a greenway is than most people out there. And so in the case of BGI, you know, this is why we operate at the intersectionality of, you know, of transportation departments and organizations, and that conversation of parks and open space and those related agencies. We work with, you know, groups that are working on waterfront issues and resiliency and climate, definitely health and health equity, and looking at, you know, social determinants of health. And how, and others, right? There's, you know, kind of community and economic development, and our public realm assets broadly, not just greenways, but certainly including them, have the ability to deliver all of these co-benefits, but are they, right? And I think that advancing the conversation now in this era of the pandemic, where these issues have come to the fore, and the historic kind of inequities that exist in public realm assets like parks and like greenways. And, you know, speaking directly to, I don't have an answer, but, you know, we're interested in the conversation around displacement and gentrification. When, you know, these kinds of greening, you know, assets and amenities and critical infrastructure come to all neighborhoods. So, you know, there's one thing that I wanted to throw in here around data and giving gravitas to your question, Susan, that in the realm of greenways, there's some data, but there's not a whole lot, not nearly as much as there are for, you know, these kind of asset types individually for parks or transportation networks and so forth. And, you know, we're excited at BGI to have just launched a comprehensive user study looking at what the Greenway is providing now before it's fully connected, and what it can provide in terms of co-benefits in the future, specifically looking at to what extent the Greenway serves as a connector to parks and open space in New York City, in Brooklyn in particular, to what extent it serves as a climate solution by reducing greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. You know, looking at, you know, who's using the Greenway, where they're using it and why, and importantly, who's not because they don't have access, or because the access isn't safe, or there's a highway that's blocking access, for example. I'll leave it there. Michelle, I know you want to jump in as well.
Sure, yeah. I want to point out the role, you know, potential role of research in science in helping to make this case that, it's really costing us dearly to not invest in these public health resources, right? So if you don't mind, I'm going to share. I have a couple of slides that I want to tell you about some research that end with a calculation of return on investment. In terms of greening and its impact on violence reduction. So yeah, so this is some research that I've done, and in Philadelphia we're dealing with a lot of vacant space and vacant land, perhaps not so much in your communities, but we have a program to clean and green. It's called the Land Care Program of the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, and they clean and green around 12,000 vacant lots per year. So that's maintenance and additional 200 or 300 new vacant lots per year. So they're cleaning them up, planting grass, some trees, and putting up a picket fence to reduce the construction dumping debris. And they're permeable, so people can enter these spaces. But my colleagues and I ran a randomized controlled trial of this intervention. We took 600 vacant lots and we randomly assigned them to, either to be controls and that remained vacant throughout the study period, or to be cleaned and greened. We actually had 2 different treatment arms, but they look similar. And so they were scattered throughout the city, and this is over a 38-month period. And we looked at, so these are the publications that came from this. We looked at changes in crime and violence around these vacant lots, the intervention lots, as well as the control lots. We did a survey with almost 500 residents living near the lots. So we had some of their reports about their community. We found significant reductions in crime overall, but I think most significantly gun crimes, gun violence, of almost 30% reduction compared to the control lots. So this greening intervention is playing a role in violence prevention, which is so much relevant to public health in my city anyway. So looking at the survey data, we also found that people living near the land care lots reported significantly less depression and feelings of worthlessness. And so, we have run a return on investment. So if we're talking about fewer gun assaults, gun related robberies, homicides, there's a real benefit to society, to at large, to the city, to taxpayers. So we did a return on investment. So typical cost of initial treatment here is $1,600, with only about $200 per year in maintenance. And if we compare that to the costs of the criminal, associated with criminal justice system, to lost livelihoods and all of this from being, victim of gun, violence, we calculated $26 in net benefits to taxpayers and $333 to society at large for every dollar invested in this program. And so I think that evidence such as this, and it comes from collaborations between researchers and folks on the ground, cities, and folks on the ground that are actually doing this work. It's a little tough. We have to designate the controls, and it takes time and looking for funding to do it. But yeah, so research, you can look to research as one of those tools to help leverage and change the story. Like as Connie Fishman, I'm reading here in the web chat, changing the mindset, looking at where are we actually spending our money? Where does it actually make sense that we spend our money? Can we shift those things?
As you're talking about data, Michelle, is there a driving indicator that we can use to help change some of those mindsets? And I guess I would open that to all of you.
Well, this one spoke for itself. The city of Philadelphia increased by $2 million after we published
Dollars top, right? Dollars top.
This program.
Yeah. I love that study, Michelle. I didn't realize you're behind that study. I use that one all the time for a lot of our proof points. But I think it's the money talks. I think that it's almost always that, really, I will say. And then also the more quantifiable health benefits, I would say mental health benefits, like writ large, and the burdens that can cause on health systems and taxpayers, et cetera, I think have been the most compelling.
And in the case of the Greenway, I would say, use is a proxy of, of impact overall, and then looking at demographics of users as well to see which communities are represented and which aren't, which, community groups, types, people of color, people of different incomes, different age breakdowns, gender. For example, if we say, right, that the ideal park, green space, Greenway, this type of green space assets have the ability to deliver benefits equitably when access is given and provided equitably. Physical access, as well as the perception of, that this amenity is for everybody. We have to measure whether that's the case. And I think that use and user demographics are some really important indicators.
Yeah, and sorry, and just to add on to that, I wanted to mention one of our partners is this organization called Reimagining the Civic Commons, working with 10 cities and diving really deeply with the various stakeholders from mayors, communities, on how to change those hearts and minds in those local communities around parks and green space, and how to activate and be responsive. And they take on something that we've been thinking strongly about, which is sort of an inventory approach. So looking across the whole system of neighborhood parks and thinking that as a real portfolio of assets that should have value behind them and should be invested in, as similarly that the mass transit system might be, or roads and other infrastructure. So how do we just change lexicon, change language around the ways we talk about parks and green space as a financial and valuable asset that cities have.
There's a lot of questions and comments in the chat and the Q&A about disparities. And I think it would be really great if you all could go back and review breaking down the barriers for access to nature for vulnerable populations.
So, we think about this.
It's like, yeah, mom and apple pie.
Yeah.
How are we doing it?
It's a little complicated, but I mean, what we think about this often as we, I did see another sort of question around sort of what are the barriers largely for even New York moving past a certain threshold of park access, right? And they're sort of related, right? One of them is that we look at cities have been planned in a very certain way for a very long time, right? Redlining, I mean, they're very historically discriminatory practices that we, at least in the parks and green space here, are trying to reverse. So it's very complicated to think about how do we do that. And I think, we do this in a number of ways, or the ways we talk about it with our cities is, always having at this point community members and the right residents at the table when making these land use decisions and investment decisions in these portfolios, right? And obviously these have to be thoughtful, long-term, well invested processes to really elicit strong feedback or real feedback from communities as we think about designing. But also, how do we
the right questions to get
and asking the right questions? I mean, you know more than I do, Suzanne, right? It's just huge, right? But it is, again, a huge paradigm shift. But then separately, we think about we do need to think creatively about how we are unlocking parks and green spaces, especially as cities grow, especially as land becomes more expensive, especially under current budget crises. So how are we thinking about areas where everybody can go, not just the Central Park, but for us, we think about green schoolyards, right? Schools are in every neighborhood, in every city. Places like Atlanta, we open up all of the schoolyards needed to move the needle, you can increase access by 15 to 20% in a city, right? Even 40% in some cities, just by opening up and refreshing schoolyards to be public parks, right? We think about this, so that's, I can go on and on about this, but there's many different ways we talk about unlocking those different opportunities. And then of course we have to think about the ways that we budget. So how are city budgets be invested in neighborhoods and in community spaces where the long disenfranchised residents live, and how do we continue those investments and prioritize those investments first? So again, long processes and very complicated but important conversations for us to have right now.
If I could add on to that and also try to touch on a couple of points in the Q&A about open streets in New York City, and then how to create more space, how to create more parkland in a city that is so densely developed already. And I think, just quickly on the topic of open streets, it's been so fascinating and exciting to see what's been going on over the last 9 months of the pandemic. There's one open street, Brooklyn Greenway Initiative worked with community members in Greenpoint, Brooklyn to, kind of sponsor, organize and maintain an open street on the weekends that's adjacent to part of the Greenway there. It's a way to kind of activate a new segment of Greenway that's just being opened. There's another open street in North Brooklyn on Berry Street, where it has been so popular and so successful. And I know it's not just, that one on Berry Street, there's others on the Lower East Side and other places that have had similar success. And they're actually putting forward a petition now to ask the city to convey the importance of making that open street permanent, as a place for people to get outside, to ride their bike with a kid, or just take a walk with your aging grandparent or whoever it is. And I think that, the kind of relating to open streets, and then this other question about land use and quote, creating space, park space in New York City, I think this is where bigger is not always better. To kind of go to your point, Susan, about parkland in the Bronx, there are these very large parks, but they're not accessible to most people who live, at least not within a 10-minute walk, most people who live in that borough. And I think that's where these, smaller pocket parks, greenways, yes, I'm biased, but, greenways as a typology, this network, if you will, of green space throughout our city. So we don't just think about parks as destinations, but kind of living in a park-like environment overall, right? That if the city is crisscrossed and kind of networked with green space of all types, then everybody can live within a 10-minute walk, a 5-minute walk of a meaningful green space where they can connect with their neighborhood, their community members, where they can be outside, get some fresh air. Sorry, there's a siren or something going on outside. So I'll stop my answer now. But I think that, bigger is not always better, and thinking about a network of green space and these, kind of smaller fingers that go through and between communities and connect our larger green spaces is the way to think about that, especially in a city where, it's so developed and so densely populated already.
Right. It reminds me of Copenhagen's 5-finger plan, right? They are trying to connect all these kind of corridors of green and then also using them for transportation. So I really laud you for the work that you've been doing.
I'd love to answer the question as well, if I...
Yeah, sure, Michelle, jump in.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I hope this isn't annoying, but I want to share a couple of slides with you once again. Because this is a really cool survey, a national survey called The Nature of Americans that I think you should check out, all about sort of our culture and around nature's parks and green space, about, including barriers to access. And so this is why I wanted to start with it. But this is, one of their findings and it really spoke to me, because this is what I've heard when I talk to residents of Philadelphia about, what, for example, what if your doctor told you you really should spend more time outdoors, and, what do you think about your nearby or local parks and green space? And it's, hands down, safety or lack of feeling safe in and or on the way to those spaces is a huge barrier for people of color, really. So just looking at response to this question, and so what are the sources of that lack of feeling of safety? And I think that we have been seeing some of this in the chat box, but and talking about it as well. But it could be active exclusion. I think that our public parks have a huge history. It's ingrained in our history that we are looking to exclude people of color from public spaces. We see it in, Christian Cooper reminded us all of the active, being viewed as a threat, based on your, on your race or perceived race, right? And so, active discrimination, but as well as policing, police response to, calls about individuals being a threat. What if we, in addition to all of these new signs that we're putting up here about, social distancing and wear your mask, how to behave in this park, how about, guidelines for alternatives to calling the police when you see someone that you think doesn't belong and looks a threat to you. So rethinking these things, as well as, looking inside, looking at our, land managers, natural resource managers, and, who tend to be typically all, to have, a lack of diversity there in terms of, managing spaces, names of spaces. It's symbolic, it's real. And ingrained in our system of policing and our economic system. So anyway, I just wanted to add some of those things. So sorry, I meant to stop share.
Great, that was really helpful. So it seems like a lot of our audience is using green spaces in Manhattan, but also Brooklyn. Brooklyn isn't far behind. Well, no, they're a little far behind on this survey, but with Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island closely aligned. Let's see. There's also a question about how we can improve environmental justice, like the BQE and rail lines running through Brooklyn and Queens. How can we improve environmental justice by better taking advantage of their planted embankments? So how do we combine infrastructure, both physical infrastructure and social infrastructure, with green infrastructure?
That might be more of a Terri or Michelle question.
Yeah.
Especially for a large project like the BQE in New York, it's not easy, but I think this is where, using the momentum that's been built over the last 8-9 months of the pandemic, and kind of organizing and building a bigger voice, using all of the resources we have to point to already available data, creating more data where it exists about the benefits, lots of co-benefits of of this kind of infrastructure, and pointing out, as the map of the Greenway network in Brooklyn shows, and as I believe that BGI's user study, research will show in very stark terms, that there are more injuries and deaths. There are greater health illnesses and health issues in communities that don't have access to, in our case, we're measuring the Greenway, but the same can be said for other green space, obviously, as we've talked about this evening, kind of pointing to all of the available data and pushing as hard as we can to our elected officials. And in a place like New York City, we might be sort of uniquely positioned in that because of the change in New York City's charter, there are something like 75% of our city local elected officials who are going to turn over next year in our local election. And so using the opportunity for that massive turnover to advance the ideas that we're talking about here this evening, talking with our current elected officials, talking especially with those prospective elected officials, with all of the candidates, and making sure they know that these are important things to us, and looking at environmental justice in particular. I don't know, that's not an easy answer.
Not an easy answer. So, Benita, I guess I would ask you, in your work with mayors across the country, there's a lot of conversation in the chat about development, and the cities are in distress, and how do we look at economic viability if we're, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, about every square foot is hotly contested and it's always the highest and best use. Are there measurables for health benefits? Are there, as Michelle showed, are there benefits for, it's not only about the dollars, it is also about creating jobs. It's also about keeping people out of hospitals, right? And all these things. So how do we get mayors to work together to share this kind of information?
So the whole purpose, right, behind this whole panel, right, is the fact that it's so clear how critical these public spaces are for the benefits of residents. And so I think, again, the conversation is very hot right now among the city leadership, really. And so we're seeing partners from, the U.S. Conference of Mayors to the National League of Cities, leadership really talking about the fact that these spaces are super critical. But that does not necessarily take us away from the fact that city land is increasingly expensive and budgets are getting slashed, certainly, as we've talked about. But there are mayors across the country, again, I already spoke about Mayor Strickland and others, who have where the 100% park access target is part of a larger comprehensive plan to develop around their economic development, right? So they think of that, the parks, as integral to their growth plan. And I think that one of the joys of working sort of with the mid-size and small cities is that they actually have the opportunity to think about this before things really blow up, to be totally frank, right? Some of them, and especially now during the pandemic, as we see sort of a lot of flight from cities towards exurbs, towards the smaller towns, there is really a need for mayors and planners to plan for growth in a way that's smart, the ways that they're able to think about the livability and also just think about the economics around their cities and new jobs that parks and green space can create. So that's actually an integral part of a lot of mayors thinking already. The question about developers is a whole other one, right? Where in New York City, under Mayor Bloomberg and also under de Blasio, the idea around public-private partnerships very much blossomed. And, obviously it's controversial in some places, but the need to really broker those PPPs is real in order to really deliver on the benefits for all. And every city really operates differently, but it's a critical audience to engage, are the developers.
Thanks, Benita.
Yeah.
So I want to be mindful of our time as much as I really have enjoyed this conversation. I think we've run up to 6 o'clock and our clock is ticking. So I'd just like to thank you all, Michelle, Benita, Terri, for sharing your insights. And now I'd like to invite Elizabeth to come back and close our program.
Well, I want to add my incredible thanks to all of you speakers and for your incredible insights. All of you have brought great depth and knowledge to this conversation. And I tend to think of myself as someone who knows my way around parks and parks information, but I learned stuff tonight and I'm sure I'm not alone. So thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you again, Susan, for your masterful moderation as always, and for helping us shape this series. I want to remind you that we have a final session in this series, which is scheduled for next week on November the 17th at 5 p.m. And we'll discuss the topic of active transportation. So I urge you to join us there, and you can RSVP by visiting mas.org/events. I also want to thank, as I always do, my incredible colleagues at MAS for all their work in pulling this program together and in managing all the logistics of making it go smoothly. I hope if those of you who've joined us are not already a member of MAS, that you will consider joining. Your membership helps support our advocacy and our policy work, as well as programs like this. And we very much would welcome you into our fold. And finally, I hope you will join us again next week and for other programs in the future, and that you should all have a wonderful evening this evening, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you again.
Thank you.